about some things that's happened since 1850. So what's going on at this point in time in American history? As we talked about last week, the Constitution was ratified in 1787. One of the last acts of our government before the Constitution, when we were a confederation of states, is they passed the Northwest Territories Act. Now, the Northwest Territories became the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. This was the first real act of Western expansion. About the same time that that's going on, people were starting to move into what would become the 14th state, which is Kentucky. So we're starting to see some Western movement of the people. And this is beginning at the early part of the 1790s. I also want you to understand that history is not just time, place, and people. Yes, time, place, and people are important. But history allows us to look back and ask questions like why? Why did it happen? And what can we learn from what happened? So let's keep those thoughts in our minds as we go through tonight. So basically there were two routes west out of the original 13 states. In 1790, most of the population was within, I want to say 100 miles of the coast. It's probably even less than that. It was probably closer to 50 or 75 miles of the coast. So the population is close to the coast. That is where the American people are living. And that's because there are no real roads. This is the time before railroads. And the principal form of transportation is by water. So you could go up the Hudson River. The Hudson River is navigable. The Delaware River was navigable up to Philadelphia and a little bit beyond. The Potomac was navigable up to where today Washington, D.C. is. So as far as you could go inland about as far as a navigable river would take you. But there were two routes west. One was, if you left Philadelphia, they had actually built a road from Philadelphia to the central part of the state, if you know where, around the Harrisburg area, which is now the capital of Pennsylvania. There was a road, it was improved. Sometimes it had planks, it was a plank road. Sometimes it was just improved dirt and some gravel road. But we had a road. But from there, it's where the Allegheny Mountains start. And you had to take trails from there over the Alleghenies to Fort Pitt, which we now know today is Pittsburgh. That was one route. Another route to the west was when you get to the end of this road, you turn south. And we talked about it a little bit last week. You go down through the Shenandoah Valley, which had been this trade route of the Native Americans from the southern tribes to the northern tribes. And then when you got down to about where Roanoke, Virginia is today, that trail forked. One went to the Charleston and Savannah, Georgia area. The other went through what's called Cumberland Gap, very instrumental historical part of our past, into what is today Kentucky. Two different kinds of people went those two different directions. Into the Northwest Territory, as you know of Ohio and Indiana and Illinois today, vast corn and vegetables and all kind of agricultural produce is produced in the area we call the Northwest Territories today. Very, very fertile soil. The people who went this way were the larger families. A lot of families from New England, some from New York, Mid-Atlantic. But if you had a family and you had a family farm, and your family had been on these farms for years, the soil is starting now to wear out. And there's news that there's great potential for farmland in the Northwest Territories. And so these families would pack up. They would find themselves a way to get to Fort Pitt, where the Ohio River begins. You could have a boat built, basically an elaborate raft, float to Marietta, Ohio, go to the land office, and get land in the Northwest Territories. That was one way. This is a multicultural group of people. These are people from New England, like I say, Mid-Atlantic. They come from all faiths, all backgrounds. And what was happening, entire villages, especially in New England, entire villages were packing up into the Conestoga wagons that you've heard about, making their way through New York or however they can get to Fort Pitt, get on these rafts. Well, when the whole village went, the preachers went with them. I mean, they took the whole town. That is what is settling the Northwest Territories. What is happening in Kentucky? Well, it's a different kind of person. The Scotch-Irish had come down through the Shenandoah Valley. And the people that in the beginning that were going to Kentucky were generally single men, younger single men that either had no land to farm, maybe were in trouble with the law, could be a lot of different reasons, but you're having a strong demographic of younger single men going to Kentucky. Just the exact opposite of who is headed to the Northwest Territories. If you've been to Kentucky, you'll understand this description. Eastern Kentucky comes out of the Appalachian Mountains. There are several small rivers that run through Kentucky. These small rivers have small little river valleys. Not a whole lot of good farmland in Kentucky, but there was just enough farmland to raise corn. And you know what you can get with corn? You can make whiskey, or in Kentucky they call it bourbon. So if you have a bunch of single young men and plenty of bourbon, that is Kentucky in the 1790s. I'm just going to let your mind run with that for a little bit. All right, let's reflect back now. I told you that history is more than just time, place, and people. Let's look back and see some of these let's see what we can learn. We had this great awakening in the 1700s, mainly up in New England, Mid-Atlantic area, great pastor, George Whitefield. But his movement and the movement of the Great Awakening and the other preachers that participated in it, it basically died out within a generation. And you ask, why did it die out? Well, the good part was many, many tens of thousands of souls were saved. And that's great. But the existing churches of the day did not do a good job of assimilating these new converts. In fact, the established churches of the day really didn't appreciate this revival. And so, in our language today, there was not a whole lot of discipleship going on. It did not transfer to the next generation. And by the time that this time that we're talking about, the 1790s, that Great Awakening had died away. But there was a good thing that came out of the Great Awakening, and it did have lasting impact, and that is it laid the political foundation of our country. It emphasized individual liberties, which is a new concept in the world politic of the day. I want you to think about this. In the 1780s, when we as a nation are establishing our government, it was only the second time in recorded history that we're aware of where a group of people were willing to submit to a law as the supreme ruler of the land, rather than a strong king or general or something like this. I want you to think back to the Old Testament of the Israelites. The Israelites worshiped Yahweh. Moses was the first messenger bringing the first law to the people. Even Joshua, the great general of the day, when he took the promised land for the Israelites, he remained faithful under God. And it was the law of the first five books of the Bible that was governing the people. It was not Joshua. He didn't govern the people. The law did. The period of the judges. The period of the judges are using the law to govern the people. When we were setting up our government, our Constitution became our government. The people then swore allegiance, and we do it today on a Bible, to uphold the Constitution. This is incredibly radical form of government. Look at what happened with George Washington. I'm going to take some liberty here and actually call him the Joshua of the day. He was the great military leader. He was then elected president. And after 2 terms, he walked away. He said, "I am not your king. We are a nation of laws." So that actually did come out of the Great Awakening. All right. That is the countryside that that's existing now in the 1790s. So let's focus first on Kentucky. The year is 1798. A Scotch-Irish Presbyterian, Reverend James McGready, rides into Logan's County, Kentucky. He is going to a place called Rogues Harbor. All right, I've described the people, generally men. Rogues Harbor ought to be pretty descriptive of what this little village is like. I won't even call it a town. It's probably more like a village. But he's one of these horseback riding preachers that we're going to hear a lot about this evening. So he rides in there, and Rogues Harbor is in an area where there are 3 rivers, 3 small rivers, probably about the size of the Bosque out here. These are not Brazos River size rivers. These are smaller rivers. They're called the Red, and Jill and I have actually been to the Red River. It's got some neat canyons in eastern Kentucky. We've hiked through that area. There's the Red River, there's the Gasper River, and there's this one's a great river. It's the Muddy River. Wonder what that one was like. So we're talking about this little area, and I cannot overemphasize how small the population is. We're not talking about a lot of people. Like the population here in Valley Mills is today only a little smaller than the largest town in all of Kentucky. If you could imagine Valley Mills being the largest town in the whole state, this is how few people that are living in Kentucky at the time. That when Reverend McGreedy comes in. So he starts pastoring this little church, and he decides, he feels a call to create a covenant with his congregation. And let me read for you the covenant that was created in this little church. When we consider the word and promises of a compassionate God to the poor lost family of Adam, we find the strongest encouragement for Christians to pray in faith, to ask in the name of Jesus for the conversion of their fellow men. With these promises before us, we feel encouraged to unite our supplications to a prayer-hearing God for the outpouring of His Spirit, that His people may be quickened and comforted, and that our children and sinners generally may be converted. You see, Reverend McGreedy is carrying an ember from the Great Awakening. There's no fire, but he's got this ember, and he's carrying it to Kentucky. It says, all those who were willing to sign the covenant agreed to pray every Saturday evening and Sunday morning, and to devote the third Saturday of each month to prayer and fasting. So this is the beginning of what was going to become known as the Second Great Awakening. Give you a little background on how they conducted their services. He's got these three churches. He goes between the churches, and every quarter you have communion, and he moves around from church to church. All right, so here we go. We are now in 1799. He's at a quarterly communion, and suddenly a revival begins to break out within the congregation. It would be like us today. It would be like what we're doing here today, and revival starting to break out. He went over to the Red River. Same thing happened. Then he went to the Gasper River. Same thing happened. So this one preacher in 1799, he's hit all of his churches. The churches have been praying this prayer for a revival, and people start coming to the Lord. 1800. It starts at Red River. Word gets out mainly through letters that people are writing. Newspapers are picking up on what's happening here. So in June of 1800, Red River, 500 people show up for what's going to be a preaching series. Among the 500, 3 new ministers show up. One is a Methodist named John McGee. He's come from the Cumberland Valley of Tennessee. So word's starting to spread of what's going on in Kentucky. And so early in June, at the communion service is where this all started, revival breaks out again. Later in the month, they go to Muddy River. Even more people show up. More people are coming to faith. And it's being described as something that you would have seen in Acts 2. The next month, July 1800, they go to the Gasper River. 10,000 people show up the next month. We started with 500 in early June. By July, 10,000 people are showing up. Now, you got to remember that the biggest town in Kentucky is Lexington, and its population is 1,800. And Lexington is 100 miles away from this area. 10,000 people are showing up. Think of how many horses are bringing them, how much food it's going to take. This is now starting to be a logistical challenge to have all these people in one spot. More preachers show up. McGee has a brother. His brother comes, and a man named Barton Stone, a Presbyterian. And so what's happening now, they decide, I'm going to go preach over here, you go preach over here, you go preach over here. We'll divide the crowd up, and revival is breaking out all over this area in Kentucky. Let's go to 1801. August 1801. This is the revival that even, cultural history picks up. This one is amazing. Ministers from everywhere, of every background, show up at Canes Ridge, Kentucky. But they come together for a single purpose, and that is the salvation of the souls. 25,000 people show up at Canes Ridge in August of 1801. They're literally cutting trees down and building platforms so the preachers can preach from these platforms. And we're talking about over acres and acres. You got 25,000 people, no amplification. You're outdoors. So you're building these platforms, and these preachers would preach for a while, and then one would get up. When he'd get tired, the next one would get up, the next one would get up, and this went on for weeks. Thousands and tens of thousands of people. This is the second Great Awakening. So we're in Kentucky. This thing now spreads everywhere. It spreads across the Ohio River. It spreads into the Northwest Territories of Southern Ohio and Indiana and Illinois. It spreads back east because remember, we're at the edge of the western population right now. So all the movement is going to be back east. It goes through New York. You know how New York sits on top of Pennsylvania. It connects up along Lake Ontario with Pennsylvania. We've got a new character. Now, we've had a lot of salvation. We've had a lot of people coming to these revivals. But now we get a pastor, a preacher that we haven't seen since George Whitefield. And that is, his name is Charles Finney. He coins a term called the Burned Over District of Western New York. There had been so many waves of revival that had gone through the western part of New York, that the estimate was that every living person had heard the gospel within the past few years. And there was no one left to preach to that had not heard the gospel yet. Well, let's talk a little bit about Charles. Early in life, he studied law. He was old school Presbyterian, which means he was Calvinist. But as a young man, while he is studying the law under an attorney, he himself, his heart is warmed. He feels the real call now to become a preacher, not a lawyer. But something else happens to him. And that is, he is moving away from the Calvinistic Presbyterian doctrine, I'll use that word, and he becomes a New Measures Presbyterian. And this was what's going to really open the door for a lot of Calvinist churches. And that is, he develops this saying of will not versus cannot. The old Calvinist view was that the gospel was only for the elect, only for the ones that had been chosen to receive. And Charles Finney began saying, no, those people who reject the gospel, they're not rejecting the gospel because they cannot receive it. They're rejecting it because they will not receive it. And that became what was called New Measures Presbyterians. He also had a very, very radical practice at his church. He let women pray in public. And that really upset some of the established churches. He sent another shot across the bow. He believed that all slaves should hear the gospel. He believed that the slaves should hear the same gospel that the free people were hearing. And he became as nationally known as George Whitefield in his day. Here's a statistic. It seems like the Methodists were the ones that captured the most out of this Second Great Awakening. In 1800, 16 years after the Methodist Church had been established in Baltimore with the Christmas conference, there were only 1,000 total members in the whole country of Methodist. 1,000 members. By 1850, 34% of every church member was a Methodist. Went from 1,000 to 34% in 50 years. So what was the impact of this Second Great Awakening? Number one, thousands of new churches are started. This is different from the first one. The first one really didn't create new churches. It created converts, but the converts had nowhere to go. The Second Great Awakening, the number of people, men of the day, that were called to the ministry just exploded. They created a church, they brought in these new converts, and they were off and running. And unlike what happened after one generation in the first go-around, now there was a body for all of the converts to be under a pastor and to start learning together and growing together as a church. What also an impact was is that the two main established churches of the early 1800s, the Congregationalists, which were mainly up in New England, that was that Puritan line we talked about the first week. The Puritan line formalized into the Congregationalist church. And the Episcopalian church, which was the legacy church of the Church of England. So last week we talked about how when all the clergy left the Church of England, the Anglican church went back to England, the remnant church here in the United States became the Episcopalian church. Well, it was the dominant church of the Mid-Atlantic and some of the larger cities up through the Mid-Atlantic area. And those two churches really lost, they lost a lot of share of these new members. Their churches stayed about the same during this time period. They were not the revivalistic, evangelical movement. It was mainly the Baptists, the Presbyterians, and then, like I said, the Methodists. Those were the three growing evangelical groups. It was also a time of the rise of other churches. Let me just go through, and really not just churches, but movements. First, there's the rise of the end times churches. We know them today as Seventh-day Adventists. The Seventh-day Adventists came out of the Great Awakening. They're called Millerites. The name Millerites. It started, the end of times churches started with a man named William Miller, who was a Baptist. And he was doing a Bible study on Daniel 8 and 9. Many of you have studied the book of Daniel. Many of you have studied chapters 8 and 9 and know that's the prophetic chapters of Daniel. So William Miller was doing this Bible study, and he became convinced that he knew when Jesus Christ was going to return to the earth. This is an example from what I talked about in week 1 of the priesthood of the believers. The priesthood of the believers, as a review, is when you read your scripture. You're in prayer, you may be in a group, and you read your scripture and you say, this is what I believe this means. You have that authority. You're not bound by a doctrine. There are churches today, and broadly speaking, they're independent churches. If you go into an independent church today, non-denominational, there's all kinds of examples of independent churches with various backgrounds. Some come from the Baptist lines, some comes from the other lines. But when you go in and you probe their doctrine, you find that they really don't embrace creeds, like the Nicene Creed, Apostles' Creed. They're not a creedal congregation. It's not that they don't believe the words of the creeds, but that they just don't emphasize it. They're also not tied to a specific doctrine because they're independent and they have the Bible. And they say, this is what we believe. So this group of Millerites, they determine that the temple in Jerusalem is going to be rebuilt by 1844. Studied Daniel, went to numerology through the Bible, and it said sometime in 1844, the temple is going to be rebuilt in Jerusalem so Jesus can come shortly thereafter. The year today is in 2026. We know that didn't happen. So why are the Seventh-day Adventists still around? They keep re-examining the number. They still believe in the end times. They're moving away, I think. I haven't studied them that much, but I think they're moving away from the definite date. But their preaching and their emphasis is on the end times. That's one example. Let's move to someone else. The rise of Mormonism, 1830. Started by Joseph Smith when he published the Book of Mormon. He says he was visited by the angel Moroni. It is in this time frame where preachers are preaching a free will. They're preaching you can come to your own understanding of the gospel. And when the doctrinal guardrails are off, something like Mormonism can get started. The rise of Unitarianism, 1825. Unitarianism is, there is no original sin. There is no Holy Trinity, only a Unitarian God. And unlike the Calvinists who have been preaching original sin and hell and damnation, the Unitarians preach humans are basically good. A little side note, they are the first group that received the tag of liberal Christians. That goes back to the 1820s. This is coming out of all the evangelical things that are coming out with the growth of all these churches in what are today considered mainline denominations. You have these other groups at the same time coming out of this same general movement. There's the rise of transcendentalism, 1830s. This is a group that broke away from the Unitarians. They have no canonical book. They have no Bible. But they have a personal knowledge of God. They are the real start in the United States of the concept of idealism. They focus on nature and they oppose materialism. We know those strains are a part of our culture today. This is from that movement. You've heard of the name Henry David Thoreau. He was an early leader, later Emerson after him. But what happens in this movement is that free will, the free will to salvation, comes to dominate over Calvinism. And the free will also creates some really tough political challenges. Because it's out of this free will movement that comes in the 1840s the abolitionist. The concept that slavery is no longer legitimate. There is no justification for slavery. And so you can go back and say that the seeds of what would become the Civil War were first cast in this Second Great Awakening. Because out of this, it touched so many people, such a high percentage of the population, that a significant number of them said, I know where free will leads, and that leads to freedom for the slaves. So all of this comes together at this time. And where we had had a unifying effect at the time of our Constitution, which was really critical because the only way our country could come together as a country was for all 13 of the colonies to agree and to sign on to the Constitution. And that's where we got a lot of the historic roots of the Presbyterian Church, once again back out of Scotland, where they had had representation by each individual person. And that led to our House of Representatives and our Senate and the whole way that our government came together. It also was important that we would become a nation of law and not a nation under a person. So that was a critical time. And someone like George Whitefield was a very unifying person for that. And we talked about that last week. Now it seems that unification had left one very significant issue unresolved, and that was slavery. And it was through this second Great Awakening that it led to enough people saying that the slaves needed to be freed. And we know from that side what goes on. So you could say that the timing of the Second Great Awakening was for the liberation of the slaves, among other things. But within that movement, all these other things also got started. All these other different interpretations. So how do we bring this all back now to a conclusion on what we've been talking about here? You know, the question that we've been dealing with is, from the very opening of the series, you know, are we truly one nation under God? Did God have a special plan for us? And I believe the answer is yes. I believe we are a very, very unique country. And our uniqueness is in our form of government and in the people who make up this country. I believe that when the church has been its strongest, the country has been at its best. And when the church has been weaker, then the country has suffered as well. We are the country. We have, in some ways, a dual citizenship. We are citizens of the United States, but we're citizens also in the kingdom of God. And it has been a struggle through our 250 years that we celebrate Saturday to walk in the same direction where both of those are important. So, what has happened since that time? We go through this incredibly bloody civil war. And there's a legacy that lives today from that. But we've had some awakening movements beyond this. Around the turn of the 20th century, end of the 19th century, beginning in the 1900s. we had revival once again break out in the country. It was small and it was geographically contained, but in Southern California and Los Angeles, there's the great Azusa Street revival in 1906. And that led to a very positive way of salvation for many people who had fallen away. In some of our lifetimes, we remember the Billy Graham Crusades. Once again, that is a continuation. What Billy, when I was young and I first heard about the Billy Graham revivals, I thought that was some kind of new thing. That, oh, look, this thing has just popped up. It's just a continuation of what has happened in our country every few generations along. It seems like the embers, don't go cold, but they start cooling down quite a bit. And then the Holy Spirit comes along, breathes on them, and the next fire takes off. And so the question is, where are we today? Where are we today in this cycle? That's the conclusion of this. I do want to read a quote back from the day. Some of you may be familiar with a Frenchman who toured the U.S. in the first half of the 1800s. His name was Alexis de Tocqueville. He was for the day, a very modern historian. He came from France. The continent of Europe was still a very Christian place. So he's a Christian, and he comes from a Christian culture in France. But he wrote this after many visits across what would become known as the West. In the West in this time would be, like I said, Kentucky, the Northwest Territories. By the time he is traveling, it's also Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. Texas has come in to the Union, Arkansas. So that's the West of the day. Here's what he writes. Not until I went into the churches of America and heard her pulpits flame with righteousness did I understand the secret of her genius and power. America is great because America is good. And if America ever ceases to be good, America will cease to be great. That's a quote from the first half of the 1800s. I think it still lives today. That's what I have for the series. I skipped over some things because we could spend 30, 45 minutes on any one of those topics. But I wanted to give you this overview of really what has happened. I'll close with this. There's a phrase that I heard early in life. You don't hear it as much today as I did as a younger person. But the South was called the Bible Belt. I think all of you have heard that phrase, the Bible Belt. The legacy, one of the legacies of the Second Great Awakening, which really occurred in that first 25, 30 years of the 1800s. So from about 1800 to about 1830. Well into the 1960s, 1970s, maybe even 1980s. You could still hear people talk about the Bible Belt. 150 years after the great second awakening, the impact was still being felt within the American Southern culture. And I believe that was because there were just so many churches that were formed. There were so many people that answered the call to the ministry. And there was just great attention placed on discipleship. Within Methodism, which we are, this was when Francis Asbury traveled tens of thousands of miles on horseback, preaching to all of these Methodist congregations, raising up new ministers, and then sending them out into circuits that came to places like where we are today. The emphasis on issuing a call to service, a call to preach, the answering of the call, and the establishment of churches, and the building of a discipleship within these churches, that led to a 150-year legacy. And I think that's our call for today, is to go back to that kind of, we are small. We are the size of some of these early Kentucky churches. Now, I'm not saying in a couple of years we're going to have 25,000 people in Valley Mills on revival, but what I am saying is we can recapture that great enthusiasm for the Lord's work if we do as Reverend McGreedy did, come together as a congregation. We come together with a mindset that this is what we're going to do. We are going to pray for the souls of Valley Mills. We're going to pray for the souls for those of you who are watching online in your community. You're going to come together as your churches. And it's going to take a while. We don't know what Lord's timing is. But I think that's the call of our day. And so our Christian history here in America, hopefully once again, can flame up. Thank you. That's what we have for these 3 weeks. And I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have being here.